Welcome, everybody. I'm Cliff Lynch. I am the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and you are at one of the project briefing sessions for our virtual Spring 2020 member meeting, which will run till the end of May. We will have three presenters today. Chela Scott Weber from OCLC, Gordon Daines from BYU, who is also serving, I believe, as an ARL visiting program officer, and Adrian Turner from the California Digital Library. Each of the presenters is going to give a case study, and they're all tied together in that they are related to collection building, special collections, they're multi-institutional in nature, and they all critically struggle with the problem of scale, which is becoming increasingly difficult and painful as our special collections multiply, particularly as we move more and more into the world of digital special collections. After the three presentations, we will have some Q&A, which Diane Goldenberg-Hart from CNI will moderate. And there's a Q&A button or tool at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to use that to enter questions at any point during the three presentations as they occur to you. There's no reason to wait until we've finished all three of the presentations to get your questions in, although we will respond to them all at the end. And with that, I think that all that remains for me to do is to thank everyone for joining us and thank our three presenters again for sharing this work with us, and to turn it over to Chela. Over to you.
Thanks, Cliff. Appreciate it. And thanks for that nice introduction. We're all excited to be here, and I'm excited to kick us off. Hi everyone, I'm Chela Scott Weber. I'm a senior program officer with the OCLC Research Library Partnership, where I focus on work with archive special and distinctive collections. I'm excited to kick things off today, like I said, talking about the work that we've been doing with colleagues across the Research Library Partnership institutions in our collection building and operational impacts working group. I'll start by providing a little background about how the group came to be and the issues we're trying to address. And then I'll share some details about the tools that we're creating. A bit of background. OCLC research has a long history of work in the area of archive special and distinctive collections in research libraries. We work in special collections because we understand it to be an important site of knowledge creation made possible by the library's commitment to the stewardship of their distinctive collections. And we also recognize that the unique nature of material in special collections can make scaling a challenge. So we work to identify areas of common need and patterns of innovation to help libraries scale learning and expertise with these collections. In October of 2017, we released the Research and Learning Agenda for Archive Special and Distinctive Collections in research libraries. It was created via a really participatory, community-driven process and articulates the shared challenges and opportunities research libraries are facing in this sphere and suggests some approaches for working on them together. The agenda is guiding our work in OCLC research right now in this area, and the work I'm going to be talking about today is absolutely a part of that. So we see this work as responding to multiple needs laid out in the agenda. It calls out appraisal as being a key skill and activity, and in this we mean archival appraisal of deciding what does and does not become a part of the collection. And it urges a renewed emphasis on and engagement with appraisal in our practice. It also calls out stewardship responsibilities and collection management, calls attention to our continued struggle with backlogs and living up to our collection management responsibilities. And it identifies appraisal as an important part of kind of a comprehensive approach to dealing with these responsibilities. Beyond appraisal, we think the work addresses other issues raised in the agenda, a desire for better tools and approaches to advocacy, a need for it to engage in data collection to support reporting, assessment, and advocacy, and valuing the labor that goes into responsible stewardship and care of collections. This desire to think a little bit differently, to re-engage appraisal and think differently about what we bring into our collections is happening against a backdrop, I think, of a shift or reconceptualization of value in archives and special collections in the research library. And I don't need you to read all the words on this slide. In fact, please don't try. But it is illustrative of the way that we talk about our special collections and the way that we've traditionally used growth as a metric of value. These are descriptions of archives and special collections at 5 different ARL libraries, and I promise you that I could have used a few dozen others instead that look very similar. Nearly all of us speak about our collections in this way, using size and growth as a shorthand for value and prestige. Gordon's going to talk in a little bit about trying to create other metrics of value for special collections, but now I'm going to keep talking about collection size. A 2009 survey that OCLC Research did of special collections in research libraries indicated a 50% growth rate of special collections in ARL libraries between 1998 and 2009. A 2015 survey by McCann and Priddle indicated that 81% of responding ARL libraries are using offsite storage for their special collections. And that same 2009 OCLC report indicated that 50% of archival holdings, 68% of map holdings, 75% of visual materials, and 15% of printed materials in our special collections did not have online catalog records. Certainly, some of this has changed in the ensuing decade, and we don't have more current data, but I'm working on it. But I feel reasonably confident that many institutions might have better baseline control of their backlogs, but still struggle with backlogs of un- and underdescribed collections. And that even with significant growth in collections, we are recognizing that our collections are largely not at all diverse, equitable, or representative. And there's an increasing interest to try to remedy that through approaches like post-custodial collecting, working with community archives, and creating oral history projects. All of these approaches require sustained relationship building and trust, which of course requires considerable time and resources. And so to do the kind of collecting and relationship building we want to do, and to live up to the expectations and promises we make to donors, and to make the rare and unique collections that we hold in trust broadly and equitably available, we have to understand the resources available, not just to collect, but also to steward. Something that we heard a lot about in creating the agenda and that we think is kind of a root of this problem, is that the people tasked with making collection development decisions and the people tasked with collection management responsibilities are often not sharing information with each other at the points in the process that would support this kind of shared and holistic approach to collection building decisions. And we wanted to bring together people across a range of responsibilities to think about how to address this issue. And so we put out a call to the Research Library Partnership, and we're fortunate that a really excellent group of people responded. And these are all the folks who have been involved in the working group. It's a great group, and it includes a wide range of curatorial, collection management, and administrative roles in both academic and independent research libraries. And the work I'm sharing today is due to the efforts of everyone on this slide, and I'm grateful to everyone for the time and work they're putting in, especially now as things are upside down. So we put together some goals for the working group to explore the intersections between collecting and collection management practice, to try to find ways to better integrate collection management considerations in the collection development process, and again, to bring together the colleagues across these important and interdependent functions. Because we wanted to help people better assess the sort of total cost of ownership of collections, determine the operational impacts of bringing in collections, facilitate better communication, enable better decision-making, and ultimately be able to better advocate for the necessary resources to steward our collections. So one of the first things that the working group did was do a workflow analysis. And this is the like ugly WebEx whiteboard from that meeting. And I don't need you to read all of it, but what we did was we sort of laid out the workflow or the collection lifecycle from pre-acquisition to ongoing stewardship, and identified points of decision-making, of communication, of appraisal, and places where we needed to think about resources like labor and cost. And the green and blue and red check marks indicate a place where we needed to think about those things. And as you can see, this work basically made us realize that these kinds of decisions and need for communication happens everywhere across the whole process, and happens iteratively over time. It also helped to bring into relief the many factors and people involved in the process, in these processes, as well as the potential for communication breakdowns. And so as we began to think about these issues, and especially where they intersect, we started to see a need for a more holistic approach to understanding the resources necessary, not just for the cost of purchase, but of a collection, but for the ongoing cost of living up to our responsibilities to donors and creators and researchers. You've likely heard the term total cost of ownership. It's used especially, I think, in talking about the true cost of open source software, but it's a useful construct to help any sort of buyer or owner determine a direct and indirect costs of a product or system. Total cost of ownership is basically the initial cost of purchasing something plus the cost of ongoing operation and the necessary upgrades and maintenance. And though these costs might take some specialized knowledge to estimate, it's a pretty straightforward equation. We're putting forward a slight modification to that idea because things are less clear-cut when we're talking about acquiring archival and special collections. So we proposed thinking about a total cost of stewardship model that takes into account the direct costs like purchase price, the ongoing operational costs of stewardship like cataloging, processing, and decision-making, and also weighs the less tangible values that a collection might bring, like value to research, teaching, and knowledge creation, the value of community relationships or institutional prestige that bringing in a collection can build. And so when we talked about what we wanted to create, it was clear that we needed to produce not just a white paper or report, as we often do and will, but also wanted to create a suite of tools that would help us, to help support communication across all of the people and factoring in all those different points in the life cycle where decisions, communication, and resource allocation are key. And so we've produced two different kinds of tools: cost estimation tools to facilitate, or resource estimation tools to facilitate the tangible costs of addressing collection needs, and communication tools to facilitate discussion of both the tangible and the intangible factors that are weighed in collection decisions. And these tools are really in our attempt to express and operationalize this total cost of ownership approach, or excuse me, total cost of stewardship approach. And so I'm briefly going to walk you through the tools. I'll start with the resource estimation tools. They're spreadsheets, to be clear, but they're interactive and they're customizable. So they're a framework for you to put in information about your own institution and your own costs and capacities. We created time estimation worksheets for trying to figure out the time that it might take to catalog or process archival or rare book collections. And something we're calling the operational impact estimator for estimating both costs and the impact to your annual capacity to do this kind of work. So the worksheets take existing time estimation frameworks like University of Florida's cataloging levels, or the UC libraries levels of archival processing and turn them into actionable spreadsheets. This gives you the ability to get a quick sense of the work that might be necessary to catalog or process a collection, and what the different levels of effort and detail might mean in terms of hours. They are also a really useful communication tool, and the general sense of time necessary that you can get here can be then used in the operational impact estimator. So the operational impact estimator is built to do two things: to let you have a sense of what your capacity, your annual capacity to do collections work is, and then to look at a potential acquisition against that capacity and see both what the costs would be and also the capacity impacts would be. So it starts by letting you define the staff roles and associated salaries for everyone who works on collection management activities. It then lets you allocate, define the percentages of time the specific roles allocate to collection management activities. It then gives you the opportunity to kind of walk through the collection life cycle from pre-acquisition through ongoing stewardship, and to estimate the necessary activities, the time they might take, and who might be involved in them. And then finally, it takes all the data from your first three tabs and puts it together to give you an estimate of the capacity impact. It both gives you a total, something like, you know, here it's between roughly 3 and 7% of your impact, but it might be different for different roles. It might impact one role much more highly than another. And so and the data that we can gather through these resource estimation tools can then be taken and used as a part of our communication tools. So, sorry, no, I'm just about at time. Our communication tools factor and share and record and share information about tangible costs, like price of purchase and cataloging and processing, hidden costs, trying to identify factors that might cause extra work, like the need for extensive HIPAA or legal FERPA or legal review, promises to donors that might be administratively difficult to operationalize, AV or born digital formats that would require special equipment that the institution doesn't have, and then the intangible value of alignment with collecting scope, institutional mission and goals, potential research value of a collection, or again, that's sort of the value that comes from building relationships with communities. We surveyed the landscape and ended up creating 4 templates to aid in bringing this kind of knowledge together and support shared informed decision-making conversations, to communicate potential value, potential acquisition proposal, and a digitization project proposal, and then to communicate necessary resources, an archival processing plan, and something that we're calling an operational impact report. So what's next? You might be asking, how can I get my hands on these so that my staff will be high-fiving each other like, like my icon here? We're working right now on revising the tool suite based on responses that we got via community feedback that were really tremendously helpful and valuable. And we'll be releasing the report and the tool suite at some point in the fall. Our timeline is a little tentative right now because of everybody's, because of the uncertainty of the moment. But we stay tuned for communication about it, broad communication about it when it's ready to go. So thanks, and I'll turn it over to Gordon.
Gordon, I think you're muted. Gordon?
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So my name's Gordon Daines, and I'm a visiting program officer with the Association of Research Libraries. And I'm going to talk about a project that I'm currently involved with the Association of Research Libraries. And it's called the Research Library Impact Pilots. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the Impact Pilot project that deals with special collections materials. So let me provide some basic information to frame the research library impact pilots in a general way, and then I'll talk specifically about the special collections project. So what are the research library impact pilots? They're composed of two separate categories of research. One is a research project, which is a formal original research study that's facilitated by ARL and engaged in by its member institutions. The second is a practice brief, which is a short document designed to support practitioners with research-based information that improves library assessment work. ARL's assessment program visioning task force outlined a series of recommendations aimed at aligning the research and analytics work of the association with the goals and needs of its member institutions. Among the recommendations was to develop a research library impact framework that describes an agenda for the exploration of library services, operations, impact, and alignment with institutional mission and goals across 4 areas. And those 4 areas are research and scholarly life cycle, teaching, learning, and student success, collections, and physical space. The framework provides the scaffolding for deeper exploration across multiple library service areas and serves as the foundation for the association's research agenda. 5 research topics from the framework were identified as high priority by the ARL Assessment Committee in August of 2018. Their decisions and the identification was based on extensive feedback from ARL library directors and assessment practitioners. All of these topics are intended to help ARL members set the context for understanding and communicating the stories of the research library to external stakeholders and to provide the tools for members to tell this story locally. And by external stakeholders, we mean funders, partners, and other collaborators. So the 5 research questions are, how does the library help to increase research, productivity, and impact? How do library spaces facilitate innovative research, creative thinking, and problem solving? How does the library contribute to equitable student outcomes and an inclusive learning environment? How do the library's special collections specifically support and promote teaching, learning, and research? And how do the library's collections play a role in attracting and retaining top researchers and faculty to the institution? And like I said, my activity with ARL has surrounded this question. How do the library's special collections specifically support and promote teaching, learning, and research? And how do we communicate the value that special collections bring in those areas to library directors and others? So I've been lucky enough to work with 1 practice brief team and 2 project teams. The practice brief team is Johns Hopkins University, and the project teams, one is at Western University of Ontario, and the other is a combination or a collaboration between the University of Pittsburgh and the University of California, Irvine. And let me tell you a little bit about the different projects that they are working on. At Johns Hopkins University, they have developed a freshman fellows program. The program is an academic opportunity designed to introduce students to conducting research with rare books, manuscripts, and archival material. They are in the 4th year of their freshman fellows program, and the first students that were part of the first group of fellows are now seniors. And their research project is designed to help them better understand the impact of the freshman fellows program on the students' academic experience. They want to answer the question, did having a meaningful, deep experience with primary sources improve the overall academic experience at that the students were having at Johns Hopkins? In order to gather this information, the project team is conducting semi-structured interviews with the 4 students and with the 4 curators who participated in the first year of the program. These interviews will be used to see how the students' experience as a freshman fellow affected their academic experience. They will also be used to get the mentors' perspectives on how their experiences may have affected how they teach novice researchers how to use primary source materials. At Western University of Ontario, their impact pilot project examines the use of archival special collections by Western's history department at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, as well as by faculty and postdoctoral researchers. Western's objectives are to understand the impact of their archival holdings and services on Western's history department, understand why they serve certain members of the history department and not others, and identify opportunities to serve non-users of the archives. The University of Pittsburgh and the University of California, Irvine are using a logic model to evaluate the effectiveness of the SAA RBMS guidelines for primary source literacy. Each institution is taking a slightly different approach to their evaluations. The University of California, Irvine is using its Humanities Core program, which is a year-long undergraduate freshman course that gives students an introduction to the development of scholarly research through the use of primary and secondary source resources. They plan to compare and contrast how 2 forms of primary source workshops achieve initial learning outcomes. While both workshops, administered by UCI, will teach primary source literacy, one incorporates the principles and practices of community-centered archives and includes primary source materials focused on underrepresented histories. Thus, in addition to testing the efficacy of the SAA RBMS guidelines, UCI will examine the impact of incorporating more inclusive histories into the workshops on the learning outcomes of students. UCI's project asks, when students see themselves represented in archives, do they experience an effective response that has an impact on how and what they learn in the primary source literacy workshops? They'll be gathering information using entrance and exit surveys in order to answer this question. The University of Pittsburgh, on the other hand, is looking at 2 programs. Their Archival Scholars Research Awards, or the ASRA program, which is an undergraduate scholarship award, and their primary source integration into classroom learning sessions. The team will strive to assess the initial and intermediate learning outcomes for these 2 specific programs. The semester-long ASRA program matches each student in a cohort with a librarian or archivist and a University of Pittsburgh faculty mentor to engage in an in-depth research project. The University of Pittsburgh will also be using entrance and exit surveys, and will use the research outputs or the papers and things produced by the students as part of their assessment. They'll also be looking at how effective their primary source literacy instruction is in the classroom based on the SAA RBMS guidelines. Some ambitious projects from which we hope to learn quite a bit. So where are we now? As you can imagine, all of the projects have been impacted to varying degrees by the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the projects have just slowed down and are just a little bit behind in their timeline, where other projects have completely stalled out. However, it's important to note all of the project teams remain invested in their projects and hope to complete them in a timely fashion as soon as they can. So let me give you a quick update on each of them. At Johns Hopkins University, they have conducted interviews with the freshman fellows. and are in the process of reviewing their coding and general finding from those interviews with the freshman fellows. And later this month, they plan to do interviews with the curators using technology, and then they will code those interviews and begin writing their practice brief from there. The University of Western Ontario is, unfortunately, their project's currently on hold. They've created a focus group interview guide and are in the process of planning to shift their focus groups and interviews to an online format. They're also waiting for final approval from their ethics review board. For the Pitt UCI collaboration, the University of California, Irvine conducted 14 workshops for their humanities core courses and had actually just finished the last of their workshops before the university was shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. They've gathered 221 entrance surveys and 234 exit surveys that students completed as part of those workshops, are in the process of preparing to analyze that data. The University of Pittsburgh recruited and secured commitment from 9 of 10 Archival Scholar Research Award recipients to participate in their research study. They issued an entrance survey to those students. Then with the COVID-19 outbreak, they had to transition those ASRA students to a remote environment and have been working to facilitate their continued research and writing as part of the project. As their semester ends, they will be, it's already ended, they have issued an exit survey and are beginning to take a look at the data gathered from the entrance and the exit surveys to see if they met the initial and intermediate student learning outcomes that they had identified. Based on the SAA-RBMS guidelines for primary source literacy and the ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education. So as data collection winds down, each of the teams will turn to data analysis. They hope to identify themes and outcomes that can be communicated to their respective administrations and that show the value of special collections and the use of primary sources in teaching. From ARL's perspective, we will be discussing the infrastructure that allowed the project teams to accomplish their work and how effective it was. We will also debrief with the project teams on the tools and methodologies that they used for their specific projects to see if those tools and methodologies could potentially be relevant in additional contexts. All of this with the goal in mind to develop research outputs that will help ARL member libraries to communicate impact and relevance of what the library does in ways that are understandable and relevant to budget holders and to stakeholders. So what are our next steps? For the project teams, it's to complete data collection, data analysis, and report writing. For ARL, and particularly myself and the other visiting program officers, it's to review the supporting structures that we put into place for the project teams, the communication tools that we used, and to do a debrief on the tools and methodologies that the project teams used. We then hope to take all of that information and develop a toolkit of tools and methodologies that could potentially be used by other member institutions doing similar projects. This has been an exciting opportunity for me to be involved with ARL's research impact pilots. And we're hoping by April of 2021 to have begun gathering reports from the project teams and the practice brief teams that we will begin sharing at conferences and on the ARL website. Appreciate your time, and I'll turn things over to Adrian.
Hi everyone, my name's Adrian Turner. I'm a senior product manager at the California Digital Library, and just wanted to say thanks again for taking time out today to attend our session. So I'm going to be providing an overview and an update on the Toward a National Archival Finding Aid Network planning initiative. I'm going to refer to it as NAFAN, and it fundamentally relates to a service that my organization supports. It's the Online Archive of California, or OAC, and it relates to what we're envisioning as its future, but more generally, we're hoping that this could serve as a future vision for sizing up and scaling up finding aid aggregation to a national level, and doing so in a more robust and sustainable manner than we've done in the past. So I'd like to first provide some grounding context for this planning initiative and how it relates to OAC. Oops. So the OAC was originally conceived in 1998 as a statewide aggregation of finding aids, narrative inventories and descriptions of collections that are held by libraries, archives, and museums throughout California. And that's still really its primary function today. The last time we redesigned the OAC site was a while back, so it was in 2009, and some of the underlying infrastructure even dates back even earlier. So we've been in a place for a number of years now where we've wanted to rethink the OAC, but before embarking on a redesign and refactor of the OAC site and the underlying architecture, we thought this was a real timely moment to step back and reassess the scope and the sustainability of the service, and really start to think more expansively. So not replicating its function as a statewide and really a siloed statewide aggregation, but instead figuring out, how we could provide more persistent and comprehensive access to finding aids at a national level. And this would of course open up the research potential to end users who could gain access to a much broader array of relevant collections. It could also provide us, in terms of aggregators, with opportunities to implement some more robust integrations between finding aids and related context, as well as related digital content that is being aggregated at scale within other systems. So we suspected that other aggregators like us were starting to face mounting technical debt with their systems that were developed over the past 20 years. And we've always thought that there could be efficiencies to working collectively at a more macro level, especially if we could utilize and sustain a shared set of infrastructure. In late 2018, we received a year of LSTA funding administered through the California State Library to initially explore, working with other regional and statewide aggregators, this idea of a national finding aid network. And we'd really like to thank the California State Library for providing this crucial funding, and really also for providing longstanding support over the years for statewide services such as OAC. So when we say aggregators, here's what we mean. There are about 15 aggregators currently within the US, and they all share very similar characteristics. So within a given state or region, they're ingesting and they're providing persistent hosting and publication of finding aids on behalf of their contributors. They're primarily hosting finding aids encoded in the EAD format, encoded archival description, but in some cases they're hosting finding aids in other formats such as MARC records or even PDF files. In many cases, these aggregators are serving as the primary and de facto finding aid interface for their contributors. We also identified 3 meta-aggregators, and what we mean by that are programs or organizations that are harvesting or have harvested or indexed finding aid data or descriptions of archival context from aggregators as well as individual institutions. And within the US, the 3 primary meta-aggregators are Archive Grid, the History of Medicine Finding Aids Consortium, and the Social Networks and Archival Context, or SNAC program. We also reached out to representatives from organizations that are providing services that are fundamentally part of the archival description ecosystem, or who have expertise in the areas of organizational development, community engagement, and sustainability. And I've listed the advisors there. We had several key objectives for this 2018 through 2019 planning initiative. First, we embarked on research to really analyze and understand the current landscape of finding aid aggregation within the US. Last summer, we hosted a full-day symposium with all the project partners, and then finally we formulated an action plan to guide next steps. And I'll go into a bit more detail on each of these objectives. So the first thing we did, we started out with research to get a sense of the current finding aid aggregation landscape. And we published a report. It's called Finding Aid Aggregation at a Crossroads. I put a link here to the project site, which in turn points out to the report. There's a lot of detail and data in this report. Some of the key findings among many aggregators have all increased the visibility and collections that they're pulling together, as well as exposed connections between those collections. Aggregators, they all share ethics, a strong sense of ethics around providing open and equitable access to collections. And I think, as we suspected going into this, many aggregators are under-resourced. So they're struggling in many ways to find sufficient resources to either sustain or update legacy platforms. Last summer, we hosted a full-day symposium at the UC Riverside Library with all the project partners, and at the symposium, the meeting participants coalesced around an aspiration. So we all really think it's important to realize this vision for a national finding aid network under the circumstances. And we began to formulate some next steps reaching towards that vision, which is a key outcome from this planning phase. It's an action plan, and we posted this action plan late last year. So the action plan has 3 sections. There's recommendations for phased near to longer term next steps that we can take moving now over the next 4 to 5 years that would basically help us move from a research and demonstration set of activities to a national program. It also has a high-level description of the anticipated core functions of the Finding Aid Network. And last, it lays out the elements of a research agenda to get a current understanding of end user as well as contributor needs for this system. So going into a bit deeper in terms of what we've envisioned as potential functions for this network. So we identified a handful of functional areas. So the first is the provision of tools, regional support, outreach, and training to enable really a much broader range of institutions to be able to participate and share finding aid data. A second function is to serve as an extensive as well as continually updated registry of cultural heritage institutions with collections that are open for research. And any institution really should be able to be listed in this registry whether they have finding aids or not. So the registry data could include things like public service contact information, a summary of their collecting areas and holdings and so on. And that information should also be searchable and browsable in its own right. The third function is to serve as a persistent finding aid publication platform. And it needs to be able to support finding aids in a range of different formats, not limited to EAD. There's still many barriers for institutions to be able to build and export and create EAD finding aids. And it also needs to support frictionless processes for institutions to be able to share their finding aid data with this network. So what we're envisioning is that the system would need to support harvesting and crawling sorts of scenarios for institutions that do have a finding aid publication system in place, as well as ingest-based approaches where, again, the network is serving as sort of the de facto publication endpoint for their finding aids. The fourth function, of course, of supporting discovery, use, and reuse of that finding aid data. And there's a lot of features we're anticipating here, and those features would really be prioritized based on the user needs that we identify from the research agenda. And last, the fifth function would be to support integration of finding aid data with related context as well as content that's being aggregated at scale within other platforms, such as SNAC or DPLA, which is bringing together digital objects. It could also point to local digital asset management systems. So I've summarized some of the immediate and near-term steps that we identified in the action plan. There's a number of things that we spec'd out here, but we know we're going to need to, and we're going to want to establish an initial and multi-organizational set of partnerships to help move this thing forward. And what we're anticipating is a strong collaborative partnership. It's going to especially comprise aggregators, but also organizations that are providing archival description services, such as developers of archival collection management systems. And there will be a lot of ways for individual libraries, archives, and museums to be able to support and provide input into the work along the way. As I mentioned earlier, we anticipate the initial research and development work. It's going to be kickstarted with grant funding as well as in-kind contributions. We also want to ramp up engagement with the aggregator community as well as individual contributors to build a shared community of interest in realizing this vision. Out the gates, we want to launch into a research agenda to, again, get a current read on and to validate end user as well as contributor needs for this system. And in tandem, we do want to do some technical research and evaluation of systems to support it, to ensure we have solutions in place to be able to support harvesting, ingest, indexing, rendering of finding aid data at scale. So there's some technical analysis and prototyping work that we want to embark on. And last, we have sustainability in mind from the start. So we want to launch into business and market analysis. We want to test the value proposition of a fully realized network against hypothetical operating costs. Really, we want to scale this program based on the available resource inputs to sustain it. So the idea going into this is kickstart with some grant funding support, but ultimately it needs to be able to run on its own. So we now have an action plan and we want to implement it. Earlier this year, we've convened follow-up conversations with the community of finding aid aggregators. We've also had conversations with OCLC and the SNAC team at University of Virginia Library, as well as the archive space team at Lyrasis, to establish this collaborative framework to move forward on the action plan. And OCLC is really well situated to provide strong expertise in leading the research activities. We anticipate University of Virginia Library, which supports SNAC, could support technical assessment and prototyping of systems. Lyrasis is, of course, well situated to provide consultation on potential archive space integrations. And the community of finding aid aggregators would be involved in all of these activities along the way to shape the functional requirements for the system, as well as facilitating the sustainability and governance models that we know we're going to need moving forward. My organization, the CDL, we intend to serve a convening role, and we want to help coordinate this overall effort. Basically, we want to redirect resources that we'd otherwise put into a redesign or refactor of OAC into this more national level vision. And so where we're at as of right now is we're in the process of seeking grant funding to kickstart these activities. And our hope is we can embark on the work this fall or winter. And so with that, I'll wrap up my talk. I've put a link to the NAFAN project site, which again points to the reports and findings as well as the action plan. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the project and next steps. And thanks again for attending our session.
Thanks, Adrian. And thank you to our other presenters, Chela and Gordon. Really appreciate hearing that roundup of projects, interesting things going on in this space. And thanks for coming to CNI to share them with us. At this time, I want to invite our attendees to type your questions into the Q&A box, and our panelists will be happy to answer those here live. We also have a chat box where I've included several links to more information about the presentations that you've heard here today. We will be posting all of our slides on the project briefing page, which I chatted out to you, as well as the video of this presentation once it is ready to go, which should be in just a few days. While we're waiting for folks to type up their questions, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar is part of CNI's Spring 2020 virtual membership meeting ongoing through the end of May. And I'm sharing with you in the chat box a direct link to the schedule for the rest of the meeting. There are plenty more offerings yet to come, and we hope you'll check that out and join us again. We have another webinar this afternoon on expertise for AV collections access using machine learning on accessing AV collections, and many more to come. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. I want to go ahead and invite any of our attendees who might like to make a comment. If you are working on any of these projects, if you have questions about any of these projects, you can type in your question or raise your hand. I can unmute you and you can make a comment live or ask a question live. I was wondering, Adrian, is your project still looking for partners? I know you're about to submit another proposal for funding, is that right?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've actually submitted a proposal for funding to IMLS, so fingers crossed. Yeah, one of the core communities partners that we've really wanted to try to engage with and really ensure comprehensive participation is the is the extant aggregator community. So, so we're still having some conversations to try to ensure we're getting full coverage there. Yeah, we are envisioning that there will be different sorts of working group structures as well as advisory input structures where we want to get a lot of feedback and input on this beyond just the aggregator community. So.
All right, so if you're interested in participating in the project, feel free to reach out here now. Any final thoughts from our presenters before we close down this webinar? All right, I want to thank you all so much for your presentation and for sharing it here with us at CNI. And thanks so much to our attendees. We really appreciate your spending part of your